All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session in the Interfaith Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence's four-part series for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. This first part of the discussion, before we move into breakout rooms, will be recorded and emailed to everyone who registered for the series. Before I turn the discussion over to the moderator and IC member, Negar Abay, I want to introduce myself and the Interfaith Coalition. My name is Dorian Karp, and I'm the Senior Advocacy and Policy Manager at Jewish Women International. Today, I would like to acknowledge that I'm working from my home outside of Washington, D.C., a home which sits on the traditional land of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people, past and present. Acknowledging the land we each sit on is one way to continue honoring Indigenous people, and I encourage other faith organizations or leaders to do the same. I have added in the chat the resource I used to find this information. JWI's focus and mission is to empower women and girls and end gender-based violence. We do this in secular, interfaith, and Jewish spaces. JWI first convened the Interfaith Coalition in 2007, and now it represents 40 faith-based organizations who come together to work to end violence against women and girls, with a focus mainly on impacting and effectuating change through federal legislative advocacy. This month, we're hosting this four-part series that'll look at the intersection of race, religion, and domestic violence. Thank you for entering the space today, and I look forward to seeing you in the final session next week. Now I'm going to turn it over to my amazing colleague and friend, Negar.
Thank you, Dorian, and thank you all for joining us today. We're excited to have this session. It's going to be a little bit different. My name is Negar Abay, and as Dorian mentioned, I serve with the Public Affairs Office of the U.S. Baha'i community as the Economic Justice and Gender Equity Officer. And we're delighted to be a member of this interfaith coalition. You'll be hearing my voice a fair bit for the first part of this discussion, but we're very happy to also have with us today Reverend Lucinda Kent, who I will introduce a little later. And we're looking forward to hearing from all of you, as Dorian also mentioned. So we're going to break out into small groups and hope to have a really participatory discussion in the latter part of the session. And so you have a sense of the flow for the day. For today's session, I'll start with an introduction and some framing remarks, and then pass it over to Reverend Kent, and then back to me a little bit before we break out into the groups. And we have a couple of discussion questions to get the conversation going there. We have quite a few people on the call, which is wonderful, but because this isn't a webinar, we really ask for your help to keep that muted button on so that we can hear the speakers clearly and stay on track. We acknowledge that the subjects we'll be talking about today are for many people associated with trauma, and so please do whatever you need in terms of self-care. And during the breakout groups, we invite you to share thoughts and questions with particular compassion and empathy for others. If you have questions or comments during the session, please feel free to make use of the chat. We may not get to all of them, but we'll do the best we can to address as many as we can along the way. So I'm going to try and share my screen here. You may be wondering, all right. So you may be wondering why in Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we want to be speaking about economic inequality. And a basic premise of this series that the Interfaith Coalition has organized is that domestic and gender-based violence cannot be vanquished in isolation. To foster conditions that allow for collective thriving, social structures and culture will need to be transformed, and the roles of individuals, communities, and institutions recast in light of shared moral commitments. And we are trying to eliminate and participate in a conversation that really demonstrates that religion as a system of knowledge and practice has much to offer in this regard. So this session is a little different, as I mentioned, in that its main aim is to fertilize thought and to make a connection between concrete actions on the ground and larger efforts to change systems. And we wanted to also break down the artificial barrier between what are often cast as women's issues, like domestic violence, and economic issues. We're going to cover quite a bit of ground in the first part to allow for a good discussion at the end. So sort of bear with me as I share some basic statistics and facts. So in talking about economic inequality, it's important to acknowledge that domestic violence is not just the experience of those in poverty. DV affects households across the economic spectrum, although resources available vary widely. And when we talk about economic inequality, we're not only concerned with poverty, but also with the concentration and extreme concentrations of wealth and the relationship between the two. So what allows for some people to amass more wealth than they know what to do with, while others struggle daily to meet basic human needs? And this is a question that's become even more salient during the COVID pandemic. So in this session, we'd like to consider, as Dorian mentioned, the nexus between economic inequality, gender-based violence, and racial injustice, which are intimately connected from two angles. You know, the many angles one can come at this. We're going to look at two. One is the immediate challenges or symptoms resulting from extreme economic inequality and domestic violence in that context. The other angle is the bigger question of the underlying root causes of such inequality and what might allow for transformative and lasting change. So we'll start first with some of the symptoms or signs of extreme economic inequality in the US, as these are statistics we're not always familiar with. And there are many statistics that one can turn to, so I'm just going to share a few here. So financial insecurity is something facing many households. More than 1/3 of American adults do not have $400 in savings to meet an unexpected expense. Close to 1/3 of American households pay more than 30% of their income in housing costs, and 1 in 4 renters pay more than 50% of their income in rent and utilities. As we've seen during the pandemic, this is a significant risk that an extended period of reduced wages could result in evictions, pushing more families into homelessness. Northwestern Mutual found that the average American household owes $29,800 in consumer debt, not including home mortgages. And after the coronavirus threat fades, millions of American households will be on the hook for bills they couldn't pay during this crisis, plus interest and fees. Not included here are the exorbitant and unequal burdens of healthcare costs, food insecurity, college debt, eroded public investments, and factors that affect women disproportionately, such as unpaid and poorly paid care work. The extremes of wealth and poverty that currently exist have widespread detrimental effects on all of society, but significant racial and gender disparities in income and wealth mean that there are particular disadvantages for some. So with respect to income or wages, for every dollar, this is a familiar statistic, for every dollar paid to white non-Hispanic men, Latinas are typically paid 54 cents, Native American women 57 cents, Black women 62 cents, and white non-Hispanic women 79 cents. And wealth disparities are even starker. So in a 2019 survey of consumer finances, the wealth of Black families was found to be less than 15% of that of white families. And for Hispanic families, it's less than 19%. If you take the average or mean wealth of white families, it's $840,000 more than the mean wealth of Black families. That's, of course, everyone's divided. So these statistics also, don't reflect undocumented immigrants or urban and rural disparities, or the diversity of conditions in categories such as Asian and Pacific Islanders. So there's a lot more sort of inequity and difference in there. A 2019 study by the National Women's Law Center, again pre-COVID, showed that while the US poverty rate for white men is 7%, it's 22% for Native American women, 20% for Black women, and 18% for Latinas. And white men without college education have also experienced increased economic disadvantage in recent years. And this group has been particularly susceptible to opioid addiction, suicide, as well as influence of harmful gendered and racialized ideologies that can fuel violence. What's evident, no matter the measure, is that economic inequality in the US is not only extreme, but has been on the rise. And in 1980, if you look at 1980, the top 10% of earners had incomes about 9 times that of the bottom 10% of households. And this ratio has increased every decade to an increase of 39% by 2018, which is the highest of any advanced economy. Another statistic reflecting this growth in inequality is CEO compensation, which has grown 940% since 1978, while typical worker compensation has risen only 12% during that time. Again, the inequality is greater when looking at wealth, not only income, so assets and all the things that constitute wealth. The top 10% now owns 70% of all wealth. The richest 0.1% of Americans have the same combined net worth as the bottom 85% of Americans. And the 50% of Americans with the lowest wealth have just 1.2% of the total. Such inequality hasn't been seen since the early 20th century. And these wealth trends have been especially hard on young Americans. Millennials are the first generation expected to do economically worse than their parents. And racial inequities have also widened in this period. Meanwhile, in the first 6 months of this pandemic, 1 out of 5 Americans filed for unemployment and 1 out of 5 lost healthcare insurance. Yet the total net worth of 643 of the richest Americans rose by $845 billion during this period. So that's the context of economic inequality with statistics that are widely available and many are discussing. What does this level of inequality and financial insecurity mean for those experiencing domestic violence? It means a lot of things, which many of you know, many of you are working in the field know firsthand, including limited resources and social services for DV survivors in low-income neighborhoods and counties, which is usually sort of accompanied by greater police presence and sort of justified mistrust of the criminal justice system. It means heightened vulnerability and economic dependency on the abuser, loss of wages and employment due to abuse, and fewer choices with regard to work, as well as the possibility of a compounding abuse at work. Abrupt termination of cell phone contracts and leases accrue additional costs, and any chances at creditworthiness are undone in this context. Housing insecurity and evictions have been shown to plague women and children most acutely, and poverty-related stressors on all family members make abusive behavior harder to address. And studies have shown over and over again that these vulnerabilities affect the vast majority of DV survivors. So there are many factors that contribute to the economic inequality disproportionately affecting women and Black and Brown communities. These include gendered and racial discrimination in employment and pay, numerous historical and contemporary barriers to wealth, such as discriminatory policies and practices limiting home ownership, as well as disparate impacts of mass incarceration. More than 3 times the money is spent on mass incarceration in this country than it is on public education. And policy exclusions like that of farm and domestic workers from basic social security and work benefits. And there are, of course, also more generalized factors such as corporations acting only in interests of shareholders, which has really become prominent in the last few decades, regressive taxation policies, and diminished economic democracy. What we do not have, is an economic system that guarantees decent pay and work conditions for most workers. We do have an economic system that is burdened by legacies of inequity and intergenerational disadvantage. What we need is an economic system and accompanying culture that are built on the understanding that the welfare of any segment of humanity is inextricably bound up with the welfare of the whole. Our collective life suffers, and that our collective life suffers when any one group thinks of its own well-being in isolation from that of its neighbors, or with disregard for the natural environment which sustains us all. And so with this understanding in mind, there's a pressing question facing all of us and our communities, which is, what are our own possibilities for addressing the injustices around us and caring for our fellow human beings? And with that question in mind, I'd like to introduce Reverend Lucinda Kent. She is the pastor of Van Buren Methodist Church in Washington, D.C., and spearheaded the transformation of their parsonage into a transition home for women and children coming out of domestic violence situations. Her congregation's experience, I think, really speaks to how religion can cultivate an orientation of service to others and introduce shifts in norms and attitudes that are essential to the broader structural and cultural change that we've started to talk about here. And so I'm not sure how much time we'll have for questions and answers with Reverend Kent. Hopefully there will be more conversation in the breakouts as well. But if you have questions for her, please put them in the chat and we'll try to get to at least a couple of them. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Reverend Kent.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's so exciting to see so many of you here. I know we were hoping it would be well participated. And so anyway, thank you. Thank you for taking your time today on something that is very near and dear, at least to my heart. So Negar has offered a lot of staggering statistical information that we really can't ignore. And it is a problem that, unless it's addressed from the top down, there's limited hope that we can significantly turn things around. Although I think that caring for grassroots efforts will help to make a difference, one household at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time. As we are approaching election, I think that we need to be mindful that we have to care about where our vote does go and what are the priorities of the people that we're voting for. I know there's a lot of focus on the presidential election, but there are other people that we are also voting for that will impact us on a more local level. And if we cannot shift politically, and if we cannot have laws that create equity, equality is a really wonderful word, but I think the issue is equity for those individuals who are vulnerable. It tends to be the women with children, although certainly in 2020, the face of domestic violence is definitely much broader than it may have been 20 years ago, or that we were aware of a couple of decades ago. Money creates empowerment and vulnerability, and we just can't really ignore that fact. There are resources that are difficult to find, or if we are able to access them, they're insufficient. Again, I think, we are talking about the top down, having politicians in place who make this a priority. And this is not just, domestic violence is not an issue that lives with only the disenfranchised and for those who have reduced economic ability. I think the general statistic is 1 in 4 households experiences domestic violence. So you just count the doorways. So I think that this is even more prevalent than people are willing to admit, because there is just a lot of shame associated with it. And it definitely is the silent killer. And I think it's a secret that people tend to keep more than they're willing to share for all of the reasons. Now, on the local level, which is how my worshiping community has decided to try to make a difference. Van Buren is a very modest worshiping community. We're right on the line of Northwest Washington, D.C. and Tacoma Park. And what we did have was a church house, a parsonage that had been closed up for almost 20 years. I was appointed to Van Buren about 5 years ago, and I tried to encourage my worshiping community to consider using just what we have, and to consider using it to reach out to the community, with no intentions of evangelizing or bringing people into the church. Let's just do a good work for the sake of the work. It took a little rethinking. Unfortunately, I think that many houses of worship have a focus on how can we bring more people inside on Saturday or Sunday or whatever your day of worship is. And so just that part to help my worshiping community rethink how they are good neighbors in our local zip code. Took a little effort, but I made it a priority. And I wanted us to focus on a community that was particularly not well resourced. And so we reopened the house. I started the cleaning out. And the interesting thing is people saw me working on the cleaning out of the house. They just wanted to come help. They just wanted to come help because I let them know that we were not using this for sacred purposes. We were using it so that we could care for someone within this community for the sole sake of caring, and no other agenda in mind. And people just kept showing up. So from a grassroots level, people are interested in transforming lives, and people are interested in doing work that helps the community in some way. And when they see that you're willing to work yourself, they're very glad to come and work alongside you. I had people from all walks of life, from all denominations, from some who were not even related to a denomination, who were just excited that a church would consider doing something that had nothing to do with the church, but had a lot to do with caring for people that we didn't know. I will say that my worshiping community was wondering who will be in the house. And I invited them to consider that, does it really matter who? Does it really matter who? So not only has it been such a wonderful labor of love, I now have other houses of worship within the Methodist Church and outside of the Methodist Church who want to hear how we did it and how did we make it work and how is it working and how could we help them do something same or similar. I don't know that we thought people were watching because we're just a little church on the hill, but the impact and the message has really been wonderful, even to be invited to speak with all of you wonderful people. So while I say that this is a problem that starts at the very top of things, from those who are empowered financially and from those who are empowered politically, and we do need to steer the ship at that level. And so any of you who are connected in that way, that's where the powerful conversations happen, because the stroke of that brush is so much broader in impact. But those of you who aren't, we can make a difference. We can make a difference. And I don't know that it matters how many we make a difference for. It's the one that we can help, that we can save, that counts.
Is it now open for questions?
Yeah, if people would like to post any questions to Reverend Kent, they can. And then I'm going to share a little bit more, and we can also do questions in the breakout. So yeah, please feel free to put any questions there. I think it's so helpful really in what you've been sharing, Pastor Kent, to think about the change is it's not an either or. So it's not just policy and structure, but we also need individual hearts and minds to change and culture to change. And that religion and faith have a really important role to play in sort of shifting our calculation of what matters and reprioritizing our commitments. And so it's really powerful to kind of see that. And I think, you know, every community of faith has examples of that. And it's something I think a moment where we need true sources of hope, it's nice to bring to light. I wanted to ask you, I'm sure, I think there are other questions coming as well, but also how was this effort received in the neighborhood, like with other neighbors? I'm presuming not all the neighbors were from your worship community. And so is there a story there to tell as well? And then there's some other questions I can.
Well, while I am affiliated with a denomination, I think that we have to make space to keep an open mind and to make room to step outside of whatever our denominational box may be, to understand that we are a global people and that many hands make light work. And I think what was the most inspirational part of all of what we were doing was how people were motivated by the fact that we weren't trying to make sure we had them in a Bible study or in our worship, and that we were really working solely to contribute to the community. And I think it's so important, especially, I mean, considering the group that we have on our live stream today. Everyone is from some particular walk. Although we've all come together because this is important and we consider this to be a priority. And I think this is how we steer the ship, you know, from the grassroots level of things. We have to come together. It's such a major issue that no one group, I think, can be effective in a vacuum. And I think part of what has allowed this to continue to grow is because it's remained in a vacuum of sorts. I think part of how we address it is to speak to it and to have a willingness to work with one another. I think also sometimes in these houses of faith, we don't always look like the safe place to go. And, you know, some people have to own that. And some of us have to work to offer a different narrative. I am hoping that at least my church and my worshiping community offers a different narrative. And the opportunity not only invited other people to come and work with us, it opened the minds of my own worshiping community. You know, someone put a question in the chat about, let me go back to it. Asking if I could speak a little more about doing something for the sake of caring and not for religious purposes. What does it mean to motivate people to act from just a desire to care without a spiritual motivation? It means showing up without the intention of the language that we use in my denomination is evangelizing. Showing up without the intention of trying to figure out where are you in your faith journey and how can I invite you into mine? And not that that isn't part of a general landscape, but this had to be separate work. And part of paving the way was to work with the community so that the neighborhood could receive it as their own as well. Negar was knocking on the door of my opening up how not every neighbor was excited about the house. And there certainly were a few days where the police were called and they showed up and we had no idea why they were even there, because we weren't doing anything that required the police. And so there were some complaints, and that was before we had people in the house. The first family that we moved into our house, it was a woman with 5 children, ages 12 and younger. And the youngest children were 2 or 3 years old. They were twins. And they were not documented. And I mean, they just came with a lot of issues, a lot of challenges. And the neighborhood, while the general neighborhood welcomed the house and the guests that were staying in the home, we had a few neighbors who did not feel that way. And they were lodging complaints at the school, because we helped to get the children registered for school. We helped put in place the tools that the families, we ended up taking in 3 different families. But the first family, we put in place the tools that they needed to thrive. We helped get the children in school and doctor's appointments, and we had to help sort of handhold the very basic things of how to do grocery shopping, how to make good choices, how to get financial resources and legal resources and all of the resources that were needed. And all the while, there were a few neighbors that we also had to navigate. So not everyone loves the work that we're doing. And so it isn't for the faint-hearted, but certainly there were more of us who were supportive than weren't. And we understand that we probably will continue to have unexpected visits from unexpected people for whatever reason. But we made a difference. And we made enough of a difference where other people are curious about what that experience was. Let's see, what obstacles did I encounter? So the main obstacle were the few neighbors that were, it's a neighborhood that is experiencing gentrification. So I will say that. So some of the newer neighbors that have paid the top dollar for their lovely homes in the zip code were not expecting that there would be the UMC house caring for people who were very much on the opposite side of the spectrum. And as I said, we had the police show up. Sometimes we had no idea why they were showing up. They created problems not only at the house, they were calling the schools that the children were enrolled in and trying to create some chaos there. There was a few different things. Sometimes there would be mail that was not welcome. Sometimes I would have people just come and find me on Sunday because they knew I was very easy to find on Sunday, just to tell me that I didn't get the proper permissions. And I mean, they have no idea what the background work was, but they were packaging a narrative that we were not compliant. There were a couple of neighbors that were saying things like they knew that this was just a ruse because we were going to sell the property. And it was a little bit of everything. It's one of the reasons why it is important to include those people in your neighborhood and community, so that it's not just your effort, it's your community's effort, because I didn't have to fight it by myself. I didn't have to navigate things by myself. And fortunately, I made friends with the police who were coming, and they ended up being a place of support for us. And I invited them when they were taking their breaks during the day to use our parking lot space, because they're kind of tucked away, they can enjoy their lunch. And it was helpful for us to just have their vehicles there as a presence. So, you know, we were able to do a little something there. Let's see. So many denominations have to start to really look at and help with DV versus ignoring it or passing it off as the houses of worship are sanctuary areas that can truly help in the move on domestic violence. Yeah, so here's the thing. Even though there are female clergy out there now, it is still a male-dominated area. And I believe and suspect that the predominant male voice on domestic violent matters is probably not what it should be. And I think that houses of worship and sacred conversations sometimes are not what they should be. I think that this is an area that faith-based communities have to really have an open mind, not only on the subject of domestic violence, but also understanding it is not gender specific, it is not age specific. I find that I've been in conversations with teenagers who are just dating to help them understand what is healthy and what is not. 14, 15 years old. And so we have to be open to navigating all of these conversations. And we also have to be open to understanding that the face of domestic violence is not whatever we at least thought it used to be. Let me see. Have I had any problems with being seen as a sanctuary for the undocumented? Yeah, sure. Most definitely. But when we agreed on our intention for the house, we did not have exclusions. Our bottom line intention for we call it, it's named the UMC house. We call it the UMC house, standing for Under My Care. The intention for the UMC house was to receive women and children with under the age of 12 who were coming out of domestic violence situations, period. And we had connected with some of the agencies in our local area just so that they could equip us with information as well as points of contact, because we're not experts. We're not social services, we're not psychological services, so that we could at least gather resources in other areas of expertise to help us navigate some of those things. So sure, there was a problem, especially considering the first family. So our first family, I don't know if any of you remember, there was an image captured on Time magazine of a mother who was holding the hand of a young child and she was pepper sprayed. That was our first family. That was our first family. I didn't know that when we brought them in, but we as we were learning more about them, we learned that, and it made their anonymity even more important to be able to preserve. It's not easy work, and it's not clean, and it's not wrapped in a really nice bow, but it's worthy work. It is worthy work. We watched those children who were frightened on that first day feel at home. That was what we cared about. We wanted them to not feel like they were in a shelter. We wanted them to feel like they were in a home. And so, because of how we were open to receiving them in a very authentic way, over months, the children, they became smiling, laughing children. There were bikes left out on the front lawn, which of course there were neighbors who were not happy about that either. But for us, it spoke to the change that we were making. They felt safe, they felt comfortable, they were laughing and joyful, and we helped them to find their footing for the next step. It's just a transitional house. It's not set up for permanent living, but it put them in a place where they could relax and they could rely on being cared for, so that we could help them transition. And I think that that's been the good work that we've been able to do. And we never invited them to church. They came by every now and again, and we were always glad to see them, but we made sure not to make that part of the equation, and we made sure not to put the pressure of all that on. And it just made it very easy for them to feel welcome. Let's see, something else in the chat. Considering the response of some of the neighbors, how do you keep the confidentiality of the family's location from abusers? Well, the families that we had, well, first of all, if you see the house from the outside, you would have really no idea. Like, you would have to be in the neighborhood on a regular basis to just see everyone's movement. We had people who volunteered to drive the family when they had appointments. The children were transported to school for a while before some of the energy sort of settled and they could walk to school. It's a thing we have to navigate. There is no signage, although there is a front door. The entrance and exit happens in the back, so that you can't really see who's in the house, who's not in the house, what time they're leaving, who they're leaving with. And making friends with the police who were sent in the first place, and inviting them to just sort of park out back helped to be a deterrent of sorts. So at least up to this point, we haven't had the issue of an abuser showing up. But, you know, we invited our council person in, and we tried on the front end to let the people who we thought would be helpful to us know what we were doing, so that if that happened, we would know who to call. We would have a way to get assistance with that. But so far, so good.
Thank you so much, Pastor Ken. I love how many times as you've been speaking, you referenced we had to learn and we didn't know. And I think a lot of this is about building the capacity to be able to care and be of service to others. And that even in seemingly small efforts, I think someone made the point of we can't underestimate also what we can do in actions big and small. But even in these seemingly like relatively small actions of helping just a handful of families, we can see how sort of very different values come into conversation, sometimes into kind of contention with each other. And that also as we learn to navigate those, hopefully with strengthening cohesion, shifts can begin to happen. Because I mean, what matters more, property, market values, or caring for those experiencing need? And why do we have markets that reward individual accumulation and a certain sort of look of success and punish care for community and others? I mean, perhaps you'd want to pay more to live in a community that actually cares for others. So there's a lot of questions here, and I'll use this as a segue to kind of what we wanted to do was share a little bit of a different engagement from a faith community. So as I mentioned, I work for the Public Affairs Office of the Baha'is in the United States, and we've really we really try to engage with conversations at the level of public discourse. And we've been noticing that there's been a growing attentiveness to kind of questions of inequity and of economic inequality, and that whatever one's views on economic inequality, political or otherwise, it's increasingly evident that many are suffering, and that all of us are embedded in larger webs of relationships and structures, which are in many ways fundamentally flawed and not serving the well-being of the majority of people. So kind of what contribution can we make to some of these conversations? And so over the past year, we've been convening a discussion space with folks who are largely housed at sort of secular organizations and institutions, researchers, policy advocates, and community actors, to think about some of the root causes of extreme inequality and the conditions that would allow for collective thriving. So there's obviously a lot to discuss in there, but a few of the insights that have emerged I thought might be helpful to share today. And so I'm going to share those few, and they'll feed into kind of the breakout discussions that we'll go into shortly. So one thing that we started talking about is how conversations about extremes of wealth and poverty or economic inequality in this country often devolve into judgments about the moral worth of individuals. So like whether people are lazy or this or that, the other thing. So be they people in poverty, women, immigrants, Black people, or even on the other side, rich people, it's often judgments about individuals. And such judgments are very prone to a plethora of biases and prejudices. So not only do these prejudices need addressing, but it might also be time and sort of necessary that we recognize the need to go beyond discussions about individual moral worth to consider the moral worth of the social arrangements we live in. So many are questioning the assumption that the accumulation of material wealth is primarily a function of merit or talent or hard work, when there are clearly many other factors and structural inequities at play. And similarly, discussions which are concerned with privilege, be it class, gender, race, or other advantage, might serve us better if rather than invoking guilt or defensiveness, they raise the question of what each of us can and should be doing in our own spheres of influence with any advantage we might have. And everyone has some advantage relative to others, right? In order to contribute our part to human betterment and lasting change. And in this vein, another insight that has emerged in this discussion with this group is that as much as we have technical policy discussions about what to do with the economy, the inequality that exists is less about scarcity of resources and the brilliance of policy solutions than it is about the force of our moral commitments to each other and the spiritual principles that guide our actions. So a key aspect of this is whether we see the accumulation of material wealth as an end in itself or as a means to higher ends. And what are those higher ends? How do they relate to how we understand the purpose of our lives and how we define genuine prosperity? What defines us as a society? And part of what we're trying to learn is, as people of faith, how do we introduce these concepts into a largely secular discussion when clearly there are moral roots to these problems, right? So when we begin to think about the moral dimensions of inequality, a host of underlying assumptions and conceptions are unearthed that relate to the roots of economic, gender, and racial, as well as other inequalities and inequities. So one thing that has really emerged and we've been thinking a lot about is our conception of power, for example, and its expression in terms of domination, force, individualism, and zero-sum competition, which are also expressions that are commonly considered masculine traits. So this is also very gendered. In contrast to expressions of power such as cooperation, neutrality, and care that our society often associates with the feminine and systematically undervalues. So we've been asking ourselves, how might we think about moral empowerment? We often talk about political and economic empowerment, and they surely have a place as a means to addressing inequality, but what are the moral capacities and discernment at individual and collective levels that we need to foster so that different kinds of choices are made, so that we redefine what is in our self-interest, so that human well-being supersedes concerns with profits, so that recognition of our inherent dignity and oneness as human beings informs how we value each other, so that we shift from a culture of accumulation to one of mutuality and reciprocity, and that dysfunctional, really, expressions of power, such as dominance and exploitation, can give way to all of us learning about the power of cooperation, of love, of integrity and trustworthiness, of consultation, of humility. And you can sort of see that in like microcosm in the simple efforts of local community, what Reverend Kent was describing, as well as how these principles can be embodied in formal institutions and policies and programs. And there's a lot to learn there. This is a somewhat different conversation about economics and economic inequality than we usually hear, but it's proven quite fruitful and sort of has been led to quite a generative conversation with much to learn about the implications and applications of these insights, and also an appreciation that we need to learn from the experiences and perspectives of others. that justice demands kind of universal participation because we can't see the full picture or have any sense of what's going on ourselves. And so in that spirit, we wanted to kind of open up and sort of allow maybe like 40 minutes or so for everyone who's joined today to go into breakout groups and kind of share thoughts on what we've raised as well as other ideas. And we've come up with 2 discussion questions that your hosts will put into the chat to kind of foster that conversation. And then we'll come back into the big group. So I think we can all whisk away. All right, see you soon.
Hello. I think you might still be on mute. I'm not hearing you.
Sorry about that. I think that we are all in the unassigned group. So I'm just going to go through and put people in groups right now. There's like 18 of us. Okay. Sorry about that.